A memory module rolls off a production line in Hefei, China, from a fab the Pentagon has formally flagged as a national security concern. And Apple's lobbyists are in Washington asking for permission to put it inside a MacBook. Not a startup. Not a manufacturer cutting corners to survive a quarter. Apple. The company that has disqualified suppliers for yield problems, measured in fractions of a percent. So why would the world's most cautious buyer risk its reputation lobbying for clearance to source from a Pentagon-listed company for a chip that isn't even the fastest on the market? A ban is a lock. A lock tells you what someone valued enough to seal. Read that restriction backward, and you get the outline of this story before a single answer lands. Why would the world's most cautious buyer go to Washington for permission to source from a Pentagon-listed supplier for a chip that isn't the fastest available? The obvious place to start is the shortage. Reports across 2025 and into 2026 have flagged dynamic random access memory supply as acutely constrained across both consumer and data center segments. Samsung, SK Hynix, and Micron hold the dominant share of global dynamic random access memory production by most analyst estimates. When three suppliers control the bulk of a critical input and all three are simultaneously constrained, any manufacturer running at Apple's volume eventually looks at who else is making the part. Reports place CXMT as the fourth largest dynamic random access memory producer globally, operating out of Hefei, though independent benchmarks of its full output remain limited. Apple ships devices by the hundreds of millions each year. Each device carries multiple memory chips. Stack the modules Apple needs in a single quarter, and you are not describing a procurement order. You are describing a volume that only a handful of fabs on Earth can physically fill. CXMT is one of them. That is the geometry of the problem. My first instinct was exactly this shortage story. Apple ran short, Apple improvised. But Apple's procurement history doesn't read that way. They absorbed cost premiums and spent years qualifying alternate suppliers within the approved ecosystem, rather than reaching toward flagged ones. Apple held back from suppliers under far less scrutiny than this, for far longer. Shortage is a condition. It is not an explanation. Other manufacturers faced the same tightness and didn't file in Washington. The volume argument tells you the door existed. It does not tell you why Apple knocked. That still leaves the question. Why would the world's most cautious buyer go to Washington for permission to source from a Pentagon-listed supplier for a chip that isn't the fastest available? Apple runs one of the most asymmetric supplier relationships in the industry. When you account for what Samsung and SK Hynix supply across displays, logic, and memory combined, Apple is not simply a buyer, it is a volume anchor. A credible pivot threat is worth billions in negotiating room, even if the pivot never executes. CXMT as a real bidder in the room changes what the incumbents charge. Apple's history of using supplier competition as a pricing mechanism is documented across display and chip categories. Samsung and SK Hynix's dependence on Apple volumes is a structural feature of their businesses, per multiple industry analyses. The leverage reading is satisfying. It lets Apple look strategic rather than desperate. And I am partly convinced. But leverage only works if the threat is credible. A threat you cannot legally execute is not leverage. It is noise. If Apple's lobbyists are already in Washington, the leverage play had hit its ceiling. The ask to Washington is evidence that Apple needed the option to be real, not just rumored. That pushes the question somewhere else entirely. So, why would the world's most cautious buyer go to Washington for permission to source from a Pentagon-listed supplier for a chip that isn't the fastest available? When a material becomes strategically scarce, not just expensive, but structurally at risk of interruption, supply security stops being a procurement concern and becomes an engineering constraint at the company level. Apple is not shopping for cheaper memory. Apple is attempting to build a second inlet into a system that currently has one. Think of your city's water supply running from 3 reservoirs, all fed by the same upstream watershed. In a drought, it doesn't matter that you have 3 pipes if they all run dry from the same source. Apple's memory situation is that watershed problem. CXMT is a different river. A valve you control is worth more than a discount you negotiate. The political cost of the lobbying is real. Apple took it on anyway. That is the signal. Memory's role as a gating component in artificial intelligence-capable consumer devices has been widely reported by industry analysts. Apple's historical approach to supply risk, multi-sourcing as a structural goal, is documented across processor and display supply chains. The CXMT restriction was built to keep that memory out of advanced Western devices. The fact that Apple is formally asking for an exception is the market announcing that the shortage made Chinese memory too valuable to exclude, regardless of who made it. Here is where I will admit I don't know if this deal ever closes. The lobbying is documented. The outcome is not. And I think the outcome matters less than people assume, which is the core of what comes next. The bullish reading is striking. If Apple, that buyer, is willing to absorb political friction to qualify CXMT, that is the most meaningful third-party validation CXMT has ever received. No benchmark suite, no analyst note carries the weight of Apple's qualification process saying yes. The bearish reading is equally real. Washington can refuse. The deal may never close. Reports suggest CXMT remains behind Samsung and SK Hynix on the most advanced low-power double data rate memory generations, though no fully independent benchmark has confirmed the exact size of that gap. A module in a Hefei fab is not a module in a MacBook until the regulatory path is clear and the yield data holds up. Both readings are partly right and partly incomplete. The lobbying itself is the event, not because the deal will certainly close, but because Apple asking it all redefined what counts as an acceptable supplier in a shortage, and that shift in definition doesn't reverse even if the answer from Washington is no. So the question was never quite the right one. Will Apple buy memory from CXMT? That question puts all the weight on a single regulatory outcome. The better question is, what does it mean for the memory market and for the logic of export controls when the world's most conservative buyer concludes the approved list is no longer sufficient? It means the shortage has done what no policy argument could. It made the restriction the problem instead of the solution. My read is that the deal closing or failing is almost secondary. Apple doesn't file in Washington on a whim. When they do, they've already run the internal math and decided the risk of asking is smaller than the risk of not having the option. That calculation, made by that company, is the story. That module in Hefei may ship to Cupertino, or it may sit on an approved supplier's list that never gets signed. Either way, Apple's engineers already know it exists, know what it costs, and know what it would take to qualify it. The second valve is already in the blueprint. The ban told us what someone wanted to protect. Apple's request told us what the market decided it couldn't afford to leave behind the door. Locks are only as strong as the thing behind them is replaceable, and memory, in 2026, is not replaceable. If Washington says no to Apple's request, does that make CXMT more or less likely to reach the leading edge? Or does the refusal just accelerate the reshaping of what leading edge even means? Drop your read below. And if this kind of question is the one you want answered, subscribe. That's exactly what this channel is here for.